think then that leaves us to move on to our first keynote speaker, who's Professor Lisa Goodman. Is Lisa there?
I'm here. Hi.
Hi, Lisa. Hi again. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good stuff. So I'll introduce Lisa. Lisa, our first keynote speaker, is presently in Boston, Massachusetts. So that means it's about 1:30 in the afternoon, I believe. Yeah. Okay. You're a clinical community psychologist and professor in the Department of Counseling and Applied Developmental Psychology at Boston College. And Lisa's main research interests has been around intimate domestic violence. And she's going to talk a little bit about her research. I'm really intrigued and interested in the title of your presentation, Lisa. Nothing about us without us. Obviously, you'll expound on what you're meaning by that. So, without further ado, can I hand over to you, Lisa? Yeah, and I think you're aware that Wesley is going to operate the PowerPoint slides for you. Lisa's going to talk for around 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the session for any questions from delegates. Thanks, Lisa.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. Can everybody hear me? A thumbs up, great. And Wesley, thank you so much for helping me out with the slides. And whenever you're ready, you could just put up the title slide, and I will let you know as we go what I need. Great. Well, let me just say that I'm so excited to be here to talk with you all and really appreciate the invitation. And it's already been interesting to hear Andrew and Stephen give a few sort of remarks that really resonate with what I want to talk about. When I was asked to speak with you today, I didn't know much about pluralistic counseling and psychotherapy, I'm ashamed to say. But I took a deep dive in, and I was just thrilled to learn about the interesting work that you're doing in this area. And the more I read, the more I saw overlap and similarity and resonances between pluralistic ways of thinking and the approaches to research and practice, particularly in the areas of intimate partner violence that I have gravitated towards over my professional life. In particular, in the areas of community-based participatory approaches to research and survivor-centered approaches to intimate partner violence, both of which I'll explain more soon. And I think that the resonances and the overlaps are particularly strong in the area of collaboration, which is, I know, the theme of this conference. So I'm very excited. I want to warn you all that I'm on what I really hope is the upswing of a bout of COVID. So let's chalk up any incoherence on my part to that. Wesley, slide 2, please. Excuse me. What I want to do today is to really draw out these resonances to demonstrate what I think is the power of pluralistic principles well beyond the realm of traditional psychotherapy. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the pluralistic principles that really caught my attention and that Andrew began to elaborate, and then drill down to explore how these principles have played out in my own work, especially with regard to the complexities of collaboration. And I will be leaving lots of time for questions or discussion. Excuse me. So, and let me just also acknowledge that you mentioned the title of my talk, Michael, Nothing About Us Without Us. That phrase actually comes out of the disability movement. And it was a phrase that activists developed to, as they demanded a place at the table in developing policies that would affect their own lives. I think it's an amazing phrase that has sort of that calls on us across whatever area we're working in to really think about who we are centering in our work. And that's why I grabbed it for the title of this talk. So slide 3, please, Wesley. So 3 pluralistic ideas really grabbed me as I began to learn about pluralistic psychotherapy. And they seem almost simple on the face of it. And yet, as you well know, they are in fact incredibly complex and rarely embraced in our broader field. The first is that our clients are harmed when we take a monolithic approach to what heals, or in the case of research, what illuminates. Of course, the truth is that different approaches can be helpful for different clients or for the same client at different moments. And as a corollary, many approaches can provide useful knowledge in research. When we take only one approach, we limit our clients' growth or even harm them, as I will discuss. And we leave important research questions unexplored or even cause damage as researchers. Again, this might seem obvious to someone not in our field, but as I don't need to tell you, it is antithetical to how many of us were trained. And then the second principle, the client or community is the expert on their own lives, which means that the client or community's goals and not ours as professionals should be paramount in our work. If we want to know what approach is likely to help, we should talk to the client, or in my case, often the community. And then the third principle, clients and communities already have many resources, strengths, cultural practices, and survival strategies that they have used for a long time, that professionals should recognize and make foundational to their work. I'm drawn to these deceptively simple ideas out of a lifetime of frustration with rigidities of all kinds, starting with my own psychotherapy training, and probably many of yours. Mine was a million years ago. But I was trained very expertly, I think, in psychodynamic theory, almost exclusively as an approach to healing. And I really loved this rich and deep approach to understanding human suffering. But I also felt profoundly confined by it for the very reason that the pluralistic approach highlights. When we approach clients with one theoretical frame in our minds, we end up undervaluing how clients might come to know what they know, how they approach thinking about their own lives, the way that their own social context and identities, potentially very different from the therapist's, shape their experience and outlook. So for me, this systematic undervaluation of the client's epistemological approach really interfered, I think, with my ability to listen deeply. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. I felt these same frustrations with conventional research approaches. Again, the one-size-fits-all scientific method I learned undervalued participant knowledge and participant approaches to obtaining new knowledge. It did so in its approach to forming research questions and in its methods, both of which often serve to confirm or disconfirm researcher hypotheses, but without opening up new kind of epistemological vistas, and rarely seem to create knowledge that research participants particularly valued. And then these frustrations also echo in my work with domestic violence survivors, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, where it sometimes seems that our entire approach to helping centers on how people with power conceptualize and prioritize the challenges that survivors face. So again, more on this soon. Wesley, slide 4, please. So I want to dive into these misgivings for a few minutes, and as a way of sharing how I came to adopt what I now see. I don't feel as bad as I sound, by the way, so please don't worry. How I came to adopt what I now see as a more pluralistic approach. And I'll start with a story. So this story is about the consequences of my own mistaken adherence to a monolithic methodological approach to research, and then how I discovered CBPR, community-based participatory research. So I was in grad school in clinical community psychology a million years ago and became quickly interested in violence against women. I saw it as the epitome of gender oppression and as a portal into exploring other forms of oppression like racism and poverty. So as a young researcher nearing dissertation time, I set out to explore predictors of sexual assault among homeless women. I went to homeless shelters, libraries where homeless women congregated, McDonald's. I start where a lot of, again, homeless people hung out. And I started administering surveys to women. The surveys included the most state-of-the-art questions for asking about sexual assault. And these questions had been developed based on research on college students. The questions were very behaviorally specific, like, has anyone ever touched you in a way that felt unwanted or forced? Have they touched you here? Have they touched you there? And that remains sort of the state-of-the-art way to ask questions about sexual assault. But when I asked these questions of the homeless women I was interviewing, I noticed that often their eyes would kind of glaze over and they would sort of respond in a kind of rote way. So I asked myself, what is up? Was I triggering prior trauma? Were they just confused? Were they resistant to sharing such intimate details of their lives? I asked my supervisor what she thought, and we discussed various possibilities. In all of these discussions, not once was it suggested to me that I just ask participants, what's up, with the glazed eyes. So it took me a ridiculously long time to have the light bulb moment, and in the secrecy of a private corner at McDonald's, ask my participants what was going on. And when I finally did, the 5 or 6 people I asked all answered in the same exact way. They said, well, what is unwanted? I mean, not exactly unwanted, this sexual contact, not exactly forced either, maybe a little of both, but also not either one. The truth was that choosing to hook up with a man was the least bad option among very few choices. So sex with this guy means money for diapers, say, or a place to sleep tonight, which is worse, sex with the guy or no diapers for my kids or sleeping under a bridge. And that kind of restricted set of choices doesn't exactly fit into the sexual assault as unwanted or forced touch paradigm that makes sense for most college students. But by relying on theory and a kind of a monolithic quantitative research method over direct collaboration, I had almost misdescribed their experience, and worse, alienated and further marginalized them by asking questions that didn't match up with their experience, which, by the way, has since been given a name, survival sex. If I had listened, that could have been a term that we had much sooner. So it's not that my participants lacked voice, a term that is commonly used to describe marginalized communities. It's that they lacked listeners, and I contributed to that. So I promised myself that from then on, I would be a listener. I would not approach research questions from the outside, but would instead start from the inside, making the community of interest into partners or co-researchers, people in the best position to ask the right questions and develop the right concepts. Wesley, slide 5, please. I want to tell a second story, and this one about a different kind of adherence to a narrow or monolithic approach. In this case, it was the system that funds research that took a monolithic approach and failed to listen. Perhaps you'll find parallels in your own systems in this story. So a while back, I participated in a research collaboration with a group of women struggling with poverty, depression, and trauma. Because these things can be isolating, these women frequently struggled alone, and their loneliness was an independent source of suffering, albeit not one that got much attention. So these women came together for a series of conversations about what they needed to overcome the combined effects of poverty and depression. And they agreed that anti-poverty efforts could be helpful and that psychotherapy could be helpful too, but they needed to be integrated rather than siloed and disconnected. these conversations resulted in the development of this really innovative intervention called ROAD, Reaching Out About Depression. It was just an incredible project that combined ongoing peer support, opportunities for social connection and psychoed, social action, and partnerships with student advocates who could help participants connect with resources they needed. And cities around the US began to use it as a model. It turned out to have one particularly powerful effect. ROAD became a community for hundreds and hundreds of low-income women with depression who had been struggling alone, some of whom rarely had the chance to talk with another human being. So, and I mean, the stories I could tell you about what it was for women who had not spoken to another human being for years to come into community with others. So as it grew, ROAD began to receive funds from a few prominent foundations, which was very exciting. These foundations were thrilled by the prospect of a new type of intervention for a highly marginalized population, an intervention that came from their own formulation of what they needed. As time went on, these funders appropriately began to push for a formal evaluation of the program. Since I had been the one writing about this remarkable intervention, I was put in charge of evaluation. So here's where the problem came in. The funders defined success, or wanted to define success, as depression reduction. They were very diagnostically minded, and it seemed obvious that a group of women who were depressed, an intervention should address their depression. And that's what they wanted us to measure. Depression symptoms seemed like such a kind of a clear and precise and measurable outcome. But when I brought this idea to the ROAD leaders, who were themselves part of the community, they rejected it outright. They actually laughed out loud. And they said something like, we cannot expect low-income women to be much less depressed when they're still suffering real poverty and all that goes with it. But what we have achieved is a different kind of success that can and should be measured, which is isolation reduction. We have enabled women who have no community to form meaningful community with others. Let's measure that. And some even said, I'd rather have a friend than, or having a friend is a necessary precondition of depression and perhaps the most important thing on earth, rather than a reduction in symptoms. So when I took that proposal back to the funders, they rejected it on the ground that loneliness was not a diagnostic category, and isolation reduction was not a sufficiently hefty outcome from their perspective, their outside perspective. Eventually, this conflict killed the project, and the sort of 12-year experiment of ROAD ended. So to me, this is yet another example of what happens when marginalized communities' ways of understanding themselves and the decisions they make about how to do research that would benefit them are refashioned and reframed by experts who feel that they know better about what kinds of things our intervention should target and what our intervention should be. It turns out that ROAD leaders were ahead of their time. They were already budding experts on something that would soon explode in the US as a new research area. In this country alone, there had been 5 or 6 blockbuster books written about the epidemic of loneliness, and funding is starting to emerge for research on the subject. And by the way, I know that Europe has been well ahead of the US on this, so nod to many of you. But both of these stories, I hope, illustrate the harms that occur when the outside researcher is considered by herself or by the funding agency and other systems to be in the best position to determine the right questions to ask and the right methods to use, because she is objective and unbiased. In essence, we silence individuals and communities, rendering them, again, not voiceless, but inaudible to people who are so-called experts, people with credentials and power. Wesley, next slide, please. Thank you. So the good news is that it turns out, as many of you know, there is this research alternative. Just as pluralistic psychotherapy offers a therapy alternative. The research alternative is called community-based participatory research. And it starts with the idea that research should be a joint enterprise, a collaboration between the researcher and the community most affected by the focal issue. Hence, nothing about us without us. Collaboration, in turn, means building relationships with members of the community that are transparent, authentic, and attentive to dynamics of power. Ultimately, it means shifting expertise from the academy into the community. We, in the Ivory Tower, are listening to community members' goals, their ways of understanding their experience, and their thoughts on what methods would lead to the most useful research. There are many different research designs under the banner of CVPR, but most really center marginalized community members as research partners at all stages of the research process. Next slide, please. I know this is a conference focused on collaboration, and I want to acknowledge that collaboration with clients or communities is no easy proposition. In research, collaborations between researchers and Ivory Tower researchers and community members who are also researchers, conflict can arise around timeframes or outcomes or roles or budgets. Most importantly, conflicts can arise around the navigation of power. And so I want to end this section of the talk on research with a little clip from a toolkit that my colleagues and I developed. I have the link right here, the CVPR toolkit. But it's a toolkit that focuses on domestic violence research, and it's full of videos from amazing people talking about the challenges of collaboration. And this particular clip comes from my friend and collaborator, Carrie Lippy, talking about the role of structural power in particular, and how it flows in any professional client or professional community collaboration. So Wesley, would you be able to, it's just a 2 to 3 minute clip. And Wesley, whenever you're ready.
I think for emerging researchers, it really is just important for folks to recognize that structural oppression is a constant, and that there's no way to sidestep it, there's no way to avoid it, that the function of our society is such that it's creating constant structural inequality and structural oppression at all times. And so our project can't happen in a vacuum, it can't happen outside of that context. So just sort of recognizing that you have to always be vigilant about attending to the ways that structural oppression are happening and are affecting the project throughout all the time. So that sounds really negative, but it's a thing that's true. And so I think, one example that comes to mind that I think could be helpful is, I work now with the Northwest Network for LGBTQ survivors of domestic violence. And I have worked with them for a long time, and I am here a lot. And I have gotten to know staff here, and I'm friendly, and are on really good terms with the folks here, and love the work, and identify as queer myself, and I have done a lot of work around queer domestic violence. And so I worked on a project not too long ago where we were doing an evaluation of one of our programs, and I was working with staff. We were doing a CVPR project on that and trying to build the survey we wanted to use to evaluate the efficacy of the program. And so I'm working with staff, and we identified some standardized scales to try to see, could these work? And I was reporting back, and so I did the searching for the scales, and then we were going to go through them together. And as we're going through them, I presented one of the scales and was like, well, how do you guys think about this one? Do you think this could work? How would this fit in the setting? And the staff were like, yeah, I think it's fine. I think it's fine. And as we kind of went in more deep in the staff were like, oh yeah, this would never work at all. This is actually horrible. I hate this scale. And I was like, okay, right. So that is the kind of feedback I was looking for. And it was this disconnect for me of I'm on really good terms with folks here. I feel like I have a very open vibe, I'm super flexible. I'm also queer identified, and I'm on similar pages as a lot of folks here. And yet still I represented science in that moment, and still I represented research. And so there was an assumption that that because I brought the scale to the table as a possibility, I might have secret research knowledge about whether or not the scale is the right way to go. And so people defaulted to me. And that just is part of the function of power and oppression. I think for emerging researchers, it really is.
We got cut off right at the very end of it, but I think you got the basic idea. I hope you can hear in Carrie's example echoes of my previous stories, the way structural power was operating in a study on sexual assault among homeless women, and in the question of what to measure in the evaluation of road. By the way, I saw the point about of course, connection is important, but that is not always reflected in the way that our institutions divvy up our funding for mental health. But anyway, to Carrie's point, I think the point is that structural power is always operating. We cannot erase it. What we can do in our collaborations is be aware of it, be transparent about it, bring it right into the room in a deeply explicit way, and try to make decisions that bracket it, limit it, and name it to the extent possible. So Wesley, I'm ready for the slides again, slide 8. Great, so I want to move on now from research to practice. And rather than focus on psychotherapy here, I want to tell a few stories about domestic violence advocacy to illustrate some parallels with pluralistic thinking and counseling. But this time in our work with intimate partner violence survivors, I use the term IPV and DV, domestic violence and intimate partner violence, interchangeably here to talk about people who are abused by somebody they are in a relationship, an intimate relationship with. As many of you know, IPV was only recognized as a social problem requiring a public solution rather than being a private problem that happened behind closed doors in relatively few homes. It's only recognized as a public problem in the 60s and early 70s. Feminist activists began to respond to survivors in all sorts of creative ways that were flexible, grassroots, and responsive to the specific needs that individual survivors brought. Sort of like a spirit of sisters helping sisters. That was a phrase that was often used. And it was mostly women at that time who were seen as victims. Since then, we understand that domestic violence affects all genders. But over time, domestic violence shelters and community-based programs sprung up in communities across the United States and Europe. What they all had in common was some form of advocacy. And I understand that that term is not used necessarily outside the US. So what I mean by advocacy is simply the one-on-one work of responding to a survivor's emotional and material needs. Unlike psychotherapy, advocacy is not restricted to the 50-minute hour. It can take place in offices or cars or courtrooms or even homes. And it combines emotional support with instrumental support. So in addition to just sort of being with, talking with, counseling a client, it can mean helping survivors with things like housing, safety, justice system entanglement, and custody issues. So anyway, as these programs continued to proliferate, they began to receive more and more private and public funding. Eventually, as a requirement for receiving that funding, they became more professionalized, more standardized, more one size fits all, as programs tend to do. Funders wanted to know exactly where their money was going in a way that they could count, like how many beds are filled every night, how many services are provided. In other words, domestic violence programs moved increasingly towards the very monolithic approach that pluralism warns against. So flash forward to the last 10 years or so, there's been growing recognition of the harms of this approach and the need for a new one. In the next few minutes, I want to contrast that more standardized and monolithic approach, what some of us have begun to call a service-defined approach, which I'll explain, with the approach that emerged out of this critique. This new approach, what we call a survivor-defined approach. And it's not so new, but 10 years old or so. Survivor-defined approach, one that is closer to pluralistic thinking. So slide 10, please. So in a service-defined approach to advocacy, a survivor, domestic violence survivor, comes to a program, any kind of program, seeking help, and the advocate, as expert, offers her a menu of services. So the approach starts with a set of services, and that menu that an advocate offers can depend somewhat on how that advocate has been trained and more on the assumptions built into the program in which the advocate works. But they do not start with a deep understanding of this particular survivor's goals for herself or how this survivor understands her own experience and hopes for in the future. So from a monolithic perspective, that would be impossible. So because we have one expertise and that's what we offer, or one set of expertises and that's what we offer. So let me give you a very concrete example. A police officer takes a survivor to a domestic violence program on the heels of an especially violent or terrifying encounter. The survivor is still terrified and tells an advocate the story of what happened through tears and expressions of hopelessness. What the, say, middle-class white advocate hears in this story from, say, a low-income survivor of color triggers her own, the advocate's own assumptions about domestic violence, which are violence is the worst thing that can happen to a person, because in my world, that is the case. Therefore, when someone experiences violence, the top priority is safety from it, because in my world, there would be no competing priorities. So these assumptions would not be this advocate's alone. In fact, they are built into the way most DV programs in the US function, where most services are geared towards helping a survivor leave and develop a new life somewhere else. So the well-meaning advocate, begins with, okay, I'm going to offer you a whole lot of options. So she's thinking it's all about you and your choices, but all of the advocate's options are geared towards leaving, because that's the starting assumption that the violence is the worst thing, and therefore leaving is the right solution and the only solution. So the advocate says, I can offer you a shelter bed so you don't have to go back while you set out next steps. And then while you're there in the shelter, I can help you find an affordable place to live in a new community far from your partner. Or if you want, I can help you get a protection order that will force your partner to stay away from you, or I can help you file criminal charges. And these may be perfect for some survivors, those who want to leave. But it turns out that a minority of survivors who come to our domestic violence programs actually want to leave. In fact, in one study, national study of how survivors versus advocates define success in domestic violence programs, most advocates named permanently leaving as the most important outcome, but only 7% of survivors did. What many survivors wanted instead was help reconnecting with family or friends, help going back to school, help learning how to make safety plans for when the partner's in a bad way, sort of temporary safety plans, or help learning how to drive to gain more freedom from the partner. I just heard the other day of a case of a Somali survivor in the US who couldn't possibly leave her community for all kinds of reasons. I mean, she was entirely embedded in her Somali community in the US, immigrant community. But what she wanted was help getting her husband to write a signed apology note. So you can see that the well-meaning advocate who started from the advocate's set of assumptions about how life should be, and then offers a menu of services based on the systems monolithic approach can end up causing more harm than good, potentially leaving the survivor kind of like confused or pressured, or like she has to go along with this way of thinking to get any resources at all. And well, I'll leave it at that. Okay, so next slide, please. So by contrast, a survivor-defined approach, one that is much more consistent with pluralistic thinking, has two ideas that are central. One, as I've already mentioned, in the context of pluralistic thinking, the client is the expert in her own life and should be in the driver's seat. And clients bring enormous strengths that we should recognize and build on. Together, this means advocates have to show massive flexibility in how they respond, working in ways that don't follow the menu of services orientation and that build on survivors' very specific strengths. And I want to illustrate those latter two ideas a little bit because I think they get to the core of what I think it truly means to collaborate. So slide 12, please. So the client is the expert. Most domestic violence survivors are coming from an interpersonal context in which they had little control over the most private and personal aspects of their lives. Any of you who have worked with survivors know that, that coercive control is a common theme in the stories of survivors, where their harming partner controls what they eat and when, what they wear, where they go, who they're allowed to talk to, how they parent their children. A survivor-defined practice counters that experience in every way possible in all interactions by listening carefully and responding to survivors' priorities and goals as they see them, even when the advocate disagrees with them, and even when this brings the advocate into uncomfortable territory. It means thinking about power, how power is circulating in the relationship at all times. It means constantly checking in with themselves to make sure they are bracketing their own assumptions, including the assumption that violence is the worst thing and that leaving is the only option. It means listening to the client's priorities from within their own context, their culture, their ethnicity, their religion, gender identity, social context, rather than the advocates. So for the Somali client that I mentioned earlier, the advocate had to listen and listen again to absorb the information that the survivor had no intention of leaving her immigrant community, that was incomprehensible. Know that the way that she felt she could attain a sense of control over the situation while she stayed in her home, while she remained embedded in her community, was to get an apology. And I want to add that obtaining that apology turned out to be a profoundly important process. It happened because the very wise and attentive advocate who finally heard her ended up engaging the woman's mosque and her imam and a group of brothers from the mosque in talking with the partner. And that in turn began a process of her partner coming to recognize how harmful his actions were and how he could take steps to change. So in the end, although the advocates in the program were concerned that getting an apology was not an appropriate intervention, they bracketed their judgments, went with the Somali woman's expertise about her own life, and learned something in the process. So in addition to monitoring power and guarding against assumptions, this approach obviously means managing a lot of personal anxiety without leaping to action, as it did for that advocate, who had to bear that the survivor was going to stay in an abusive relationship. You know, consistent with the pluralistic approach, this perspective avoids dogmatism and one-size-fits-all thinking, aims for true collaboration, and seeks to highlight rather than obscure differences of all kinds. And Wesley, the last slide, please. I'm so sorry, we got a little bit behind. So that's what I just said. So now the last one. Yeah. So I want to return to the beginning of this talk when I said that pluralistic approaches seem so obvious. Listen to your clients, collaborate, avoid monolithic approaches, build on strengths. I mean, what sensitive researcher or clinician wouldn't aim for that? But I hope that I have illustrated how complex an undertaking that has been, at least in my world, how much self-reflection and self-assessment and flexibility and creativity it requires. And at the same time, what a tremendously worthwhile undertaking it is. Without pluralistic thinking, we impose, as I've tried to show, all kinds of harms on those we aim to strengthen. And we diminish our own ability to learn and grow in the process. And so on that note, I would love to turn it over to you all.
Can I come in here now, Lisa? Thanks very much for that really inspiring presentation as our first keynote speaker. I loved what you were saying in evidence of how you value clients and communities' own experiences. And I think a strong point that came across from you was the fact that we all need to stand back, whether we're researchers or counselors or social workers, and consider where the structural oppression and power lies in our relationships with research participants or clients or service users, as we would say in social work. Another key point for me was you were talking about, at the start of your talk, you were talking about how researchers often go in with a set menu of questions and participants give verbal answers, but you noticed something non-verbal, and that was that eyes glazed over. And you took that forward and discussed that with your supervisor, if I'm right. And then you thought, I need to do something about this. I need to understand what that's about. But how often, do researchers not capture that, or unable to capture that in the responses of their participants, or unable to explore the non-verbal, what someone isn't saying, but how they're portraying themselves, their non-verbal communication, and how that might get lost, totally gets lost if you hadn't looked into that and explored that. You wouldn't have been able to take your research further.
Right. Well, I think it not only it's more than it gets lost. It is, we are not asked to look for it. It is not part of the way we are trained in the scientific method. Us clinician researchers, we know how to do it, but research is sort of not the place where you do that. So I think that's where, it's not an individual level problem. It's a structural problem.
Sure, yeah. Just finally, that's what you were saying in terms of working with advocates who go along to survivors with a menu of rather restrictive services that are on offer. That resonates with social work in many ways. We talk about a needs-led service, and we go to our service users and say, what are your needs? And yet we're unable to really fulfill those needs in many ways because of funding issues, lack of resources, lack of staffing. So needs are often fulfilled, but again, it's based on there are many constraints to that as well. So yeah, choices are limited, I think, when we are working with people in many ways, and that's really unfortunate.
Yes.
So those are just some key points I had, and can we open up the floor to other people's questions or points? We have a couple of individuals have raised their hands. I can't.
We have Kaz, I think, raised her hand first. Kaz, hiya.
Kaz.
Hey there. Hi, Lisa. I just wanted to pop on and just say thank you so much. I mean, this talk was really, really powerful, and also thank you for the work that you do. It's obviously very, very important. I thought that the two examples that you gave at the beginning were, I was kind of that one where you said it's not that people don't have a voice, it's that they kind of lack, people basically may not be listening to them, so they lack listeners. I thought that was really, really powerful, and so true. And I could say so much about this talk actually, but it really entwined with what you ended on, I guess. And this idea that I guess when you're talking about domestic violence and this question of whether to leave or not, and those statistics, that I know those statistics, that a lot of people come into services and actually aren't in the place to leave, but what they're looking for is to be heard. I mean, you gave some examples, obviously, and so actually, if you come from that place of your own experience in terms of what seems to make sense, even from I think it's great because it's explaining that even from the most well-meaning position, sometimes that can still be actually causing harm, because in those cases it could be then shutting someone down, making them feel even more isolated, and also obviously then there's that theme of power. So then you're kind of putting your own power, even though it's unintentional in this sense, and then that's building on obviously a power dynamic that's already there within the abusive relationship, which of course you could apply that to other cases of, if you're in cultural minorities or whatever. So so I've taken a lot, so thank you.
Thank you. I just got a little bit inspired by your way you're speaking about these ideas, and they just make me want to follow up with a couple of things. One is, yes, I love that idea of lack listeners. I want to say that came from a survivor that I was talking to. I can't remember what I said to her, but she was just so frustrated. I guess maybe I just used now, I feel like now it's like almost like bad words, but I used the phrase give voice. She's like, you don't need to give me voice. Like, I got it. Do you hear me? And I felt such, shame about all that it revealed about the way we think in the ivory tower. She just said, I need somebody to listen to me. And that was a very big turning point for me. And the other thing you made me want to say is that, it's just so, I keep excavating as I think more and more about listening kind of radically. I may not be able to give you the thing you want. I may not be able to help you with your goals, but I have to be open enough to hear all of them. And it makes me sort of realize I'm like more and more layers of the onion about how I have not been able to do that. One area where I think as a domestic violence movement, we have only recently begun to open ourselves up to is that it's something that survivors have been telling us forever, is that they want us to work with their partners. They want to stay with their partners, and they want us to work with their partners to make them less violent because they love their partners. And, in the movement, we talk about that's minimizing, it's minimizing, or it's not being able to face what's happening because of some sort of false consciousness or masochism. It used to be masochism. Now it's more just sort of trauma, but there's a million reasons why survivors are not able to face the harm. As I sort of implied in the talk, I think that comes from such a privileged place of not understanding the kinds of harms that oppressed people experience all the time, and how to understand this in relation to all of those. And that probably working with the partner, as we've now begun to do, using ideas like restorative justice or transformative justice, is something that survivors have been saying that they've wanted forever. And I think that the apology example is you know, this Somali woman didn't use the word restorative justice, but she was describing a process that people have written books about that she just felt from her gut, and that people have been describing from their gut for decades. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your comment, Kaz.
Thanks, Kaz. Cheryl, is it? Cheryl, do you have a question or a comment? Cheryl Metzner.
Yes, thank you. I believe Kate was before me. I'm okay to just wait.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Do you want to come in, Kate?
Yeah, not a problem.
Hi. Yes, sorry about that. I had my hand up and then I put my hand down. The first thing I wanted to say was I put a comment in the chat which was about connection, and it wasn't a duh moment. Actually, it was a moment of resonance, because I've been in a meeting today where I had exactly the same thing. I actually was saying, can we talk to the young people and ask them what they want to do for intervention? So yes, apologies for that. I think the question I'd like to ask really is about how do we as researchers develop our capacity to hear, because we'll sit with our biases, our pre-assumptions, and you know, the idea that actually, yes, we want people to have voice and we want to listen. We're also going to be sitting there as people with filters. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we can become better researchers in this way.
Thank you for that question, Kate. And I didn't hear it as a duh. I didn't hear your comment, but thank you for saying that. No, I fully agree with you with how I heard it. So when you do community-based participatory research, the idea is to truly partner with community members. That doesn't mean listen carefully in the way we do when we do qualitative research. It doesn't mean that. It means to sit at the table with people from the community and to hold them in the space as co-researchers. And so they would be part of, or even in charge of, defining the questions that make most sense for the community. And then together, because I think sometimes CBPR, the ivory tower types think that they're silent, they have to be silent, they have to do whatever, and that's not true. We have expertise, we have a lot to offer. But once the community member defines the problem that they want, the knowledge that they want produced, really working together to figure out what questions will produce it, you know, and even interviewing in pairs. Because I think it's impossible to know your own assumptions and biases until you're working in a really sort of power sharing way with people from the community. And you know, sometimes people from the community have their own biases and their own assumptions that researchers, but I think that speaks to the need for a truly egalitarian, a really constant working on power sharing that needs to happen in a CBPR relationship. And then it just, I mean, I have been, I'm part of a collaboration with 20 domestic violence programs in New England that's been going on now for 15 years. And sometimes the community that I'm working with are the program leaders, and sometimes the community that I'm working with are the survivors who are participating in those programs. And I think we're still learning about each other. But I guess that would be one comment, is just to sort of work alongside. Does that speak to what your question was about?
Yes, it does, absolutely. It kind of affirms what both the desire for how research is carried out, but also potentially the difficulties of creating those spaces and always being responsive in those spaces.
Well, it's really hard. And, you know, I alluded to some of the complexities of it, but I urge you to take a look at the CBPR toolkit, because, you know, I have one colleague, Chris Sullivan, who speaks on it very honestly about what it's like to open up the budget books. Okay, we were funded by this thing. Oh gosh, now you can see my salary compared to what you're getting paid for this project. And, you know, now oh crap, if you come to my office, you'll see how I really live compared to how you live. It's a lot. True collaboration is a lot of time and a lot of sort of soul searching and a lot of soul bearing. You know, I've had, you know, I was in one project where I could not pay the survivors what they deserve to be part of the project, because if you, I don't know how it works in Europe, but if you know, there's a cliff. If you get paid a certain amount of money, you stop receiving federal or state assistance. And so, and they were furious. Like, what? You can only pay me X, which is so much less than I deserve. And I see what you're getting paid. And there's nothing you can do. Well, fix it. And I didn't know how to fix it. And they would not accept that. You know, they saw me as sort of all powerful because I had more power. And that ended up requiring mediation. And it was sort of and it ended up with lots of tears and a really strengthened connection, but very complicated.
Rapture. Yes, yeah, and being vulnerable as well. Yes, wow.
Yes, yes.
Amazing work. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate. Can I come back to you, Cheryl?
Does that work? Yeah, is that okay now?
Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. Yeah, this is just amazing. Thank you, Lisa. What you've said, a number of things just in the last few minutes about listening radically and lots of tears. And even just based on what Kate mentioned about our role, like our partnerships in those spaces. How do we become better researchers who are attentive? And I thought in the midst of my research, I know my supervisors thought I was extending the participatory space in a very uncommon way. And I was shocked. I didn't realize that if I wanted to be doing this qualitative research that I was aiming for something more participatory. And I became aware, like at no other time, that there were limits that were put on me and that I could not conduct this doctoral research in the way that I felt I should. And so as I moved through the process, this came up on many occasions, I realized, okay, I'm living in a certain bubble and my participants are in another bubble, and we both have obligations and responsibilities within our bubbles. But for me, the question became, how am I benefiting from being with her or him or they in this process? What am I supposed to be getting? What am I supposed to be doing? What is my role for my university, for my life, for my community? And it was, as you said, soul searching, opening up this opportunity into something much greater than just conducting a research project or a PhD. And I think that once we can shed some of those systemic assumptions that walk around with us all the time and just sit and muse with the idea of, okay, what am I doing here in this moment on our planet that's revolving around the sun? Like how, what am I supposed to be engaging in at this time? How can I be helpful and how can I be helped? Anyway, I could go on for hours, but
Cheryl,
it's really sobering.
Yeah, I appreciate the spirit of what you're saying so much. And I think that I alluded to this earlier, like the way that I used to think that CBPR had to be practiced was just self-abnegation. Like, I am here for you. What do you want to know? How do you want to know it? I will be your, as my, one of my colleagues called it, my secretary or something like that. I will be your secretary. And that's just not real. That's not at all the way it truly is. First of all, I needed to keep my job. I wanted to do research that I thought mattered, not just that, and that sort of fit into building sort of knowledge base that I thought mattered. And sometimes, and this is really tricky, community members have bad ideas. Just because they're there's this like lionizing of people who are in, and they do have the experience that I don't have, and that's that, but how to assess it and how to evaluate it, they might have bad ideas. And so how do you navigate that and be real with people, and be real about your own goals for yourself? In this research, it took me very long. It took me people from the community just sort of saying, Lisa, what do you want from this? Just be real with yourself. Stop it with the what do you, So I really appreciate be honest and as you suggested, look really hard at yourself.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cheryl. Anna Fox, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes, Lisa. Firstly, to say thank you. Question that kind of follows on from what was just being said there, because my special interest is working with disability, specifically autism. And what I've found in trying to do collaborative work is that we get many voices. But then with the university, you've then got the ethics community, and then you've got funders, and collaboration can, if you're not careful, can end up being this really diluted or otherwise this kind of, I've lost the plot, I don't know what we're doing anymore. And how do you pin it down? Because that's something that I find can be quite difficult.
That's such a great point. I love that phrase, lost the plot. Well, one thing that I don't know, I feel sometimes stuck in the same way that you do, and the IRB, and that's all very complicated. Sort of figuring out what you want to. There's a couple things. First of all, when you do collaborative research, you don't know from the start. You write a different kind of proposal to do the research, right? You can't know the whole narrative because you're just at the beginning of the discussion. So, but how do you begin without what we call it IRB approval? Is that what Institutional Review Board approval, ethics committee? How do you begin without approval for a formed proposal? So there's difficulties right there. You have to sort of educate your ethics committee or your IRB about the iterative nature of this kind of work. But then I guess another comment is, one thing I've learned is that, first of all, the community is just an amorphous and diffuse and almost meaningless word. So when I think of, like if I'm doing a qualitative study or a quantitative study, there are the people that I'm working with around a table, which is obviously not all the participants that I'm going to use in my research. It's a small subgroup, maybe leaders from that community, or people who are particularly interested in becoming co-researchers and learning some of those skills. And even they are not interested in participating in exactly the same way that I am. And I think that CBPR, the way CBPR is written about, does a disservice to the ways that people all want to have different roles in projects. It doesn't really make clear that people who are I'll just take domestic violence advocates. It's a frequent group that I work with, a community. They do not want to be spending all their time analyzing data or collecting data or writing about data. What they want to do is formulate the question, help interpret the results, and then disseminate. And in my younger days, I thought that wasn't true CBPR because I'm supposed to train them to be co-researchers. And they would say, would you stop? You're controlling us. We don't want to do this. So I think it was very freeing to realize that collaboration means respecting people's zones. I, in turn, had to realize that data collection doesn't necessarily go on my timetable. When there's a crisis in the community, they're like, sorry about your deadline, but sorry, not sorry. There's an emergency here and this is where we're going to go. And I would have to swallow that. Or, things like RCTs, were random assignment of participants is out of the question. We'll never do that, because that would be incredibly unethical in our community. So you don't get to do that. We don't get, but they would want to know whether something is effective. And like, how do you decide if something is effective? And I would start to teach them about research and how you prove something is effective. And then they would sort of refuse most of the methods that I knew to show that. So it all gets and I would sort of lose. By the end, we had compromised so much that I wasn't really sure that we were going to be able to prove that a certain thing worked in a way that would get them the funding that they say wanted. So I really appreciate the complexity of collaboration and compromise that is required. And, you know, for me, like in the example of road that I gave at the beginning, I was very clear. If we want to continue to be funded by this foundation, this is something they want measured, and we have to do it. We can also measure other things, but we have to measure this. And I was really sad and surprised when they were so offended by that idea that they refused it. I didn't want them to. I said, why can't we just do this plus? And they said, because it is offensive to us that you think you just do X, Y, and Z and will, lo and behold, be undepressed when you still have not provided affordable housing in this community and ways for us to really rise above poverty and therefore feel, you know, sort of less depressed. It's offensive and we won't do it. That was not a decision I would have made, and I had to just let it go. So I'm just rambling. That is less about the plot line than about the difficulties of compromise. But the plot line can become diffuse before it comes back together again in a new way. I think of it as like as Humpty Dumpty gets rebuilt in some new way.
Thank you for that. You know, I think it from what I'm hearing is that it's not it's pluralistic, not one size fits all. It's,
Here we go.
It's going with the flow and seeing how we, and then negotiating how we kind of move forwards and yeah.
But I guess, Anna, thank you. I guess here's my point of this kind of rambling response is that the negotiation has to involve both parties, not just one party. Like the negotiation has to involve, I mean, what I would have hoped is that I could educate them on what funders are like, my road partners, and then we would have done both. In this case, they had the power, and I mean, ultimately they do have the power, and I couldn't educate them. But in most cases, we each have our own expertise, and we can arrive on, we can recreate the storyline in a way that works. But sometimes the role of the researcher is to bring the narrative back into coherence after it kind of scrambles for a while. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for that. I'm just picking up on some of the comments, Lisa, that are in the chat. There are many very positive, affirming comments. A recent one there from Mick Cooper, loving your honesty and balance and how you've been describing things. It's a real move on from all or nothing perspectives towards something more nuanced.
Nick.
Thanks for all the comments. Are there any other questions? Andrew, you've just popped your hand up.
Yeah, unless somebody else wants to come in, just a very quick question. Firstly, Lisa, thanks so much. It was really, really interesting. And I'm picking up on a few phrases that have been used throughout. You talked about ivory towers and educating kind of ethics boards, and I'm just mindful. I don't know what it's like in the US, but certainly in Europe and the UK, we're reminded of the hierarchies of evidence. And as a qualitative researcher, I kind of know my place, if you like. That might be a nice way of putting it. I don't sit at the top of the hierarchy. I sit kind of somewhere down that pecking order, and supervising students who are really trying to engage in participatory research and collaborative research, which I'm totally alongside what you're saying. And if from your experience, how do we make others who might not be attuned to this research pay attention? And how do we move out of the ivory towers? How do we educate ethics? How do we educate stakeholders and funders who really, I think, should be paying attention to kind of the outcomes of these processes, as well as, I'm not pitching this against other forms of evidence. If this is a pluralistic conference, all forms of evidence have something to say, but it kind of feels that people aren't listening to this. It's not that we don't have our voice, but people aren't listening to this kind of research output.
Yeah, and I just happened randomly upon Julie's comments about the fear when we try to respond collaboratively and flexibly, and how institutions are just not ready to sometimes to take that on. And I think that there is some fear in some institutions, at least in the US as well, about taking on qualitative research, because what does that say about the scientific method and how we're sort of a legitimate discipline? Where is our legitimation if we elevate qualitative research? I guess the way that I'm really lucky, I'm in a program that really values qualitative research and community-based research. And I think counseling psychology in the US is increasingly valuing it. One thing that I and my colleagues have really pushed on, I mean, this sounds so small, but I mean, and I don't know where you all are in Europe, it'd be interesting, but you know, in my 23 years at Boston College, we, you know, have pushed towards, just in our own program, requiring qualitative courses, requiring qualitative methods to be on our comprehensives, and then pushing in our accreditation processes. We get accredited by the American Psychological Association, pushing that qualitative be understood as a required course alongside quantitative research methods, and asking them to do that in other institutions as well. And I think that, you know, alongside many other programs, our pushing has resulted in more and more recognition across the field. And, you know, I think also our moment is here. Right now, I mean, there, you know, as your research that I just heard about sort of makes clear, there is more and more attention to sort of liberation psychology and anti-colonial perspectives, and they all really require centering the subjectivity of the marginalized. And the only way to do that is through qualitative research. I think that the sort of more profound and deeper recognition of racism in our country anyway has created a lot of real soul searching about the way our quantitative methods have maintained oppression in the very way that I've described, by, you know, even unintentional, also intentionally, but unintentionally, in the way that the questions that we've asked and the way that we formulate expertise and the sort of what knowledge is important. So I think that our moment that we need to be striking while the iron is hot, because we're in a much more receptive environment than we ever have been. I don't know if you see it that way too, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And I think, you know, there is a real move towards acknowledging the importance of qualitative research. And as I'm not wanting to kind of pitch different forms of evidence, because I think they all have something to contribute. Yeah. But I think there's something really challenging about researchers and institutions kind of moving away from them holding the power, which I think is what you've been talking about. But I think you're right. It's a really nice, positive way to answer my question as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I can't see any other hands up presently. If anyone else can see other hands up. No. Okay, in which case, Lisa, can I thank you on behalf of the delegates and other presenters in the conference for your inspiring speech. There's loads of comments in the chat stream there. You can have a look at. We're just coming to the end of this session now, so a huge thank you to Lisa. You soldiered on. I mean, you did bravely, I think, getting over COVID. And
I'm about to give out. I just made it. I'm so thrilled that I made it. But thank you, all of you. You're such a thoughtful group of people, and truly, it was an honor to be here in this capacity. Thank you so much again for inviting me.
Okay.